Okay, everyone, welcome back. We are approaching the near end here. Our last speaker of the day is the esteemed scholar from the University of New Mexico, Dr. Ray Hernandez Duran, and he is professor of Spanish colonial art history at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. He received his PhD at the University of Chicago, where he preceded me, but we did overlap in fun times. And he is the author of the Academy of San Carlos and Mexican Art History, Politics, History, and Art in 19th Century Mexico from 2017, brilliant book, and various other articles on 18th century painting, 19th century museology, and art historiography. Ray has lectured and presented at venues nationally and internationally, so I was thrilled that he accepted this invitation to come and speak to us today. Please welcome Ray Hernandez Duran.
Well, as usual, I am so grateful to Cristina Gonzalez for not only putting this wonderful exhibition together, magnificent accomplishment. The catalog looks amazing. The symposium has been incredibly enlightening. I've learned so much from my colleagues. So thank you, Cristina. Thank you to Mark White and to the New Mexico Museum of Art for extending invitations to both contribute to the catalog and to present at today's symposium. Also, of course, thank you to the Toma Foundation that made this amazing program possible. Last but not least, I know it's been a long day, so thank you for those of you who have been here all day, hanging in there. As a colonial scholar who does not work on religious images, there are some of us out there who don't work on this kind of material. My main research foci tend to be more in the line of non-religious visual culture, and specifically visual culture as it relates to the intersections between politics and images. I anchor most of my work to what can be considered the late colonial period into early independence. So we're talking about the late 18th century into the 19th century, a very dynamic period, very unstable period of complex transitions as New Spain was transformed from a viceroyalty to the independent modern nation of Mexico. That's really where my interests lie. And my talk today will not be necessarily addressing directly questions of sanctity in work, but what happens to these images through the process of this transition. So my talk is going to be anchored in the 19th century, and as such can be considered a kind of coda to the wonderful presentations we have heard and seen today. So let's get started. Just a little bit of water. So, as everyone has probably seen, the title of my talk is From Universal Faith and Holy Veneration to National Politics and Modern Museology, the Invention of Colonial Art in 19th Century Mexico. In an exhibition review published in 1857 in the Mexico City newspaper El Monitor Republicano, the anonymous author commenting on the recently opened painting galleries at the Academy of San Carlos wrote, quote, "Several canvases by our past painters have been conveniently gathered in one of the galleries of the Academy of Noble Arts of San Carlos, and it creates a favorable impression of the old Mexican school, which surely deserves to be remembered as much for belonging to us as for the true merit those masters possessed. In this manner, we will see the history of Mexican painting, ancient and modern, written on monumental pages, including the noted works and any others that may be acquired over time," end quote. The author continues by identifying by name several of the exhibited artists whose works dated from the late 16th century through the mid-18th century, among them Baltasar de Chaveorio, Sebastián López de Artiaga, Luis Juárez, Juan Rodríguez Juárez, Cristóbal de Villalpando, and Miguel Cabrera, among others. Other responses from the public to the galleries of historical Mexican painting are enthusiastic, suggesting that at least for the more privileged sectors of Mexican society, the collection of paintings in the Academy were being viewed and understood in a new manner that had not been seen before. Based on local responses, it might appear that Mexican viewers might have been seeing those works for the first time, which is curious, given that the majority of the exhibited paintings had been integral elements in the altarpieces of local churches and monasteries for decades, and in many cases for several centuries. As such, they had already long been publicly accessible, definitely to members of the orders and to sectors of the local public, and thus presumably familiar images, leading to the question, what was it exactly that altered the local audience's perception of and response to those religious images? To better understand the motives for such a reorientation of colonial religious paintings, I just dropped my notes. Okay, it's the last page, so I'm done. Okay. We must first examine the political environment in Mexico City at mid-century, because everything's about politics. Art responds to political shifts the entire time. In the 19th century, what is that almost cliche now Chinese saying, I hope you live in interesting times as we are. It makes for interesting study. It might not be fun to live through, but as a historian, the more chaotic and unstable, the more interesting it is to examine and think about. After Mexican independence in 1821, the political environment in the country and in Mexico City specifically was one best described as chaotic and unstable. After the first elected emperor of an independent Mexico, Agustín de Iturbide, was deposed and eventually executed, there was a rapid succession of leaders which reflected the varied competing interests in the capital and contributed to the nascent nation's economic hardships, political destabilization, and vulnerable state. A turning point was the U.S. invasion, which led to the Mexican-American War of 1846-1848 and the subsequent loss of Mexico's northern territories to the United States. This event was traumatic and fed a fear in Mexico City of possible further invasion, not an unjustified concern, since the American president, James K. Polk, did briefly consider taking the rest of the country. The crisis motivated Mexican leaders to make concerted efforts to work together and present a more unified political front, a development that motivated a series of institutional and cultural changes after 1848. One of the things that we see was that the invasion and loss of land was a wake-up call to Mexican leadership, and we begin to see a kind of cultural renaissance in the capital as we move into the 1850s. The series of losses Mexico experienced from 1824 through 1848 led to a disillusionment with what had been the country's predominantly liberal leadership, which was blamed for Mexico's recent losses and its sad state of affairs. In response, men who had been staunch liberals began to form what would become the Conservative Party as an alternative. Although we see a range of partisan politics by mid-century, Mexico's main political debates were mainly generated by the polarized liberal and conservative agendas. The distinctions between the two parties were many. For example, the liberals, critical of Spanish colonialism and of the church's complicity in what they perceived to have been Mexico's subjugation, looked outside of Mexico for new political and cultural models, and they believed in the separation of church and state. One of the things that caused liberals' problems from the conservative perspective is that they were looking at Protestant countries, like England and the US at that moment. In terms of national history, the liberals recognized Mexico's pre-conquest indigenous cultures as the starting point, followed by the conquest and colonialism through Mexican independence. The conservatives, who felt that instead of looking at foreign nations for guidance, Mexicans should look at their own history and traditions, believed in the importance of preserving values and practices derived from the earlier viceregal period. In line with this thinking, they believed that the church was an important institution in terms of social regulation and the preservation of Mexican values, and thus had a role to play in the nation's politics. To them, Mexican history was shaped solely by Hispanicized Creoles. Consequently, their view of history began with the Spanish conquest and not before. The Conservative Party was officially formalized in 1849 by Lucas Alamán, and conservative leaders came to power in the 1850s. During this period, all cultural institutions in the capital, including the Academy of San Carlos, were dominated by conservatives, suggesting that the Academy's activities from 1846 through approximately 1867, a period of approximately 20 years, were shaped by and reflected conservative interests. In 1849, 1 year after the disastrous conflict with the US, Mexican leaders began to focus on the arts as useful tools to translate abstract nationalist ideals into a material form that would be accessible to Mexican citizens. Although a controversial figure in the history of 19th century Mexican politics, I know many of my Mexican colleagues were a little bit unsettled by this. It was Antonio López de Santana who was the primary force behind the project to create a gallery of Mexican painting. In 1849, Santana, as president of Mexico, distributed a communique or request throughout the Mexican capital asking for the creation of a gallery of artworks by national masters, just as other modern countries had done or were in the process of doing themselves. One of his primary motives was to counter Mexico's image abroad as backwards and uncivilized by presenting the nation's rich artistic heritage as on par with Europe's artistic traditions. An excerpt from Santana's petition from 1849 reads as follows, quote, "The president, Antonio López de Santana, wishes to establish a conservatory in the Academy of the best paintings, originals, and copies of classic works, most of which are found in religious convents where lack of attention and ignorance have allowed them to deteriorate. Consequently, the prelates, these are the religious leaders in the capital, are asked to circulate this request among the convents under their jurisdiction so that the latter may offer some paintings for said conservatory," end quote. Shortly after the request was disseminated, Santana fled Mexico City. He was chased out, and he went into exile, and the idea for a national gallery was forgotten. 6 years later, in 1855, when Santana, yet again, returned to the Mexican capital and was reinstalled as Mexico's president, he petitioned for a gallery of Mexican painting. Okay, so an excerpt from that petition from 1855, quote, "The Supreme Government has decided to approve and pursue the formation of a collection of Mexican paintings in the Academy of San Carlos, since, in order to form a gallery that will present the history of art among us, it would be convenient to acquire works by national artists," end quote. This time, the request landed in the hands of José Bernardo Couto, president of the board of the Academy of San Carlos. Couto immediately got to work. Of course, he had no budget for the purchase of artworks, not to mention there are no galleries or dealers or art museums at that point. So with the objective of creating a gallery of Mexican painting, he turned to the most accessible public repositories of historical paintings in the capital, the local churches and convents. Couto submitted letters to local churches and convents urging the voluntary donation of religious paintings for the collection as a patriotic duty. In cases where he was familiar with the works in a church, he provided a list of the paintings he wanted. In other cases where he was not familiar with the convent's possessions, he asked that a list of the best works in their possession be drafted and made accessible to a committee of academy personnel who would visit the convent or church in question and select works. Through this process, Goto was able to amass a group of approximately 91 paintings, the vast majority of which were religious, which is logical given their sources. Goto selected those paintings he felt were of the highest quality for public display, and he installed them in the new gallery dedicated to this endeavor. Now, these are two photos that are not, there is no photography of the galleries before 1898, so that we don't have any photographic documentation of the galleries from the 1850s, 60s, 70s. These were the earliest photographs that I was able to locate, which really illustrates, I mean, there was very little changed in terms of the way the paintings were installed or the collection. So it gives us an idea of what these early versions of the painting galleries look like. The gallery representing what was then termed La Antigua Escuela Mexicana, the Old Mexican School, was opened to the public in 1857, and the enthusiastically positive response was immediate. 4 years later, in 1861, this is in response to the popularity and attention the galleries were getting, the decision was made to expand the galleries and add new colonial paintings, this time paintings that had been confiscated from the Jesuits after their expulsion in 1767, as well as works from other closed convents, all of which had been warehoused in a closed convent. The expanded collection was then reinstalled in remodeled galleries and reopened to the public. The religious paintings Goto was able to collect were mainly extracted from altarpieces, where for centuries their value and function was tied to the manners in which they visually and physically embodied the sacred, making the holy manifest in the church space and helped guide ceremonial or liturgical practice as well as private devotion. And I'm showing you two of the paintings he was able to collect and add to the first iteration of the gallery. As I'm going to note shortly, not surprisingly, these are two important works that came to form what became a canon of Spanish colonial art. The viewing, adoration, and contemplation of the holy image bridged the distance between the eternal divine and the mundane reality of the faithful, as we have seen thanks to these wonderful presentations we've heard from today, and bringing them into closer proximity to the sacred. What becomes apparent when considering this broader circuit of visual, affective, and spiritual engagement is that religious paintings historically were commissioned and created with the intended sites of display and their function in mind. And here's a photograph of probably one of the most, if not the most magnificent altarpiece in Mexico City, the Retablo de los Reyes, which is the main altarpiece I think many of us who've been to Mexico have seen, located in the Catedral Metropolitana. What this means is that the painted religious image was not meant to be viewed and experienced, in relation to other painted images, as well as in relation to sculpted forms, all of which would have been embedded in the architectonic framework of the altar screen. The subject and scale of the painted image would have been determined in large part by its placement, given that altarpieces were not randomly arranged, but followed codified conventions that facilitated the reading of the figures and stories presented. Beyond this multimedia installation, then, being a focal point in the church setting, the images would have been engaged in the context of the Mass and other ritualized performances. Given the myriad signifying functions of the religious images in spaces of worship, what happened then when such images were removed from those original sites of engagement and moved to the secular space of a gallery? An immediate observation, as we can see by looking at the Mexican public's responses to the painting gallery at the Academy, would include noting how the relocation of religious paintings from altarpieces in churches to the walls of the Academy galleries not only reoriented how they were displayed and engaged, but also altered the status and transfigured them from holy or sacred images to man-made works of art. Polish philosopher and historian Krzysztof Pomian considered this process and distinguished between the nature of time in sacred versus non-religious spaces, and he noted that in the former, time is perceived as eternal, and the images housed within it are seen as embodying sacred presences that correspond to a universal faith, whereas time in non-religious spaces, such as an art gallery or museum, is linear, and objects are reconstituted as physical manifestations or signifiers corresponding to such things as geopolitical territories, history, national identity, etc. Referring to this process of resignification, German historian Wolfgang Ernst describes it as, quote, a museal transubstantiation, translating previously religious semaphores into pure cultural historical materiality, end quote. In other words, the relocation of sacred images to the gallery reframes them in such a way where viewers are now able to discern these objects as works of art in a modern sense. So they get extracted from the altarpieces, put in the gallery, and they become works of art that kind of motivate different approaches to their engagement and interpretation. Their value or meaning is shifted from a focus mainly on the holy subjects depicted to the objectness or materiality of the individual work now, that is, its medium, technique, scale, subject matter, style, authorship, etc., variables that in art history have been generally grouped and regarded as elements of connoisseurship. This phenomenon that paves the way for the gradual shift from what has been considered an archaic or pre-modern to early modern and modern view of the world is one that began centuries earlier in Europe. Famed German medieval historian Johann Huizinga, for instance, in his classic study, The Autumn of the Middle Ages, published in 1921, anchored this transitional moment to the late medieval and early Renaissance periods and characterized it as, quote, an ongoing reduction of the infinite to the finite. The miracle is reduced to atoms, end quote. I love that quote. Along the same lines, German art historian Hans Belting, I can't talk about this without making a reference to Belting and his likeness and image. He, focusing on the developments engendered by the Northern Reformation in 16th century Europe, examined the Protestant removal of sacred images from religious spaces and the concentration on scripture in liturgical practice. He wrote, quote, this limitation divested the images of the very aura that was a precondition of their cult. The new doctrines of justification by faith alone made pious donations of or for images superfluous. The whole concept of the votive image collapsed, and with it, the Roman Church's claim to be an institution that dispensed grace and privileges visibly embodied in its relics and images, end quote. In Mexico, given the dominance and structuring force of the Catholic Church during the 300-year period of colonial rule, we do not witness this change until the mid-19th century, after Mexico declares its independence from Spain and its leaders began to work on undoing the structural effects of the colonial hierarchies that shaped their society. It is then that Mexicans begin to take the first steps towards embracing modernity, and Mexican national identity was taking form. Couto's project to create a gallery of Mexican painting in line with López de Santana's objectives exemplifies this cultural transformation by divorcing sacred images from their long-standing status as objects of veneration and reframing them not just as works of art, but as works of art that stood as material manifestations of a particular period in Mexican national history. This operation allowed for the definition and representation of a distinct Mexican school of art. That Mexican visitors were stunned and elated to learn that they too had a venerable artistic tradition on par with that of Europe's after visiting Couto's painting gallery is the clearest indicator that moving these religious images from churches to the Academy galleries transfigured them and appended new signifying potentials to the selected works. In the Academy galleries, the paintings were no longer holy images whose significance was solely determined by their sacred subjects or veneration. These works were now discernibly man-made objects whose production and formal qualities were associated with the time and location of their production. Unlike the church, the gallery required a different set of practices and expectations that corresponded to the unfolding nationalist project being led during this period by political conservatives. Extracted from their original size of display, these paintings actually become fragments, discrete works painted by different artists at different times, in different places, in different styles, and displayed in different churches. These disparate works were now collected and gathered into the space of the Academy, a non-religious institution, and placed side by side along other similarly displaced and unrelated works, an arrangement that allowed for a reinscription or rereading of the works as a whole. Together, the new logic of the gallery provided an avenue for the presentation of the collected paintings as representative of a distinctly Mexican artistic tradition. They were no longer timeless sacred images, but paintings made by national masters and thus datable and analyzable based on their formal and technical attributes. Inspired by the gallery representing the old Mexican school, in 1861, Couto began writing what would become Diálogo sobre la historia de la pintura en México, which he completed in 1862, shortly before his death, and what is arguably the earliest publication in Mexico that attempted to outline a national history of art. There's actually a book on the history of painting in Puebla that was published in the 1820s, but it's solely focused on Puebla. This book was the first that attempted to encompass the production of painting throughout at least the central Nova Hispanic territory. In the text, which takes the form of a dialogue between three individuals, among them José Bernardo Couto and the Spanish professor of painting at the Academy, Pellegrin Clavé, historical painters are identified as national masters, not colonial or viceregal artists, and the works are evaluated based on their compositions, the artist's technical prowess, and the work's stylistic qualities. Since the main driving interest was to define a national school of art, these works, now reframed as representing the old Mexican school, were reinvented as modern works of art, and the narrative framework that was organized around them, corresponding to Mexico's national history, became the first art history in Mexico. This is always really funny to me that the first art history is colonial and it's the least familiar to people. Everybody knows the Aztec and the Maya, and then we jump 500 years to De Rivera and Frida Kahlo, but that's another talk. The works became the basis for a canon of what later comes to be known as Spanish colonial art history. The dialogic text, which recreates a scene of conversation about Mexican painting as the visitors walk through the galleries and comment on the works they encounter, also models for the reader how to move through a gallery, how to look at art, how to analyze artworks, and thus what constitutes good art versus bad art. In doing so, the dialogue fulfills a civic function, not just by educating Mexican citizens about their history and culture, but by instilling a sense of civic or patriotic pride. An index in the dialogue that exemplifies this transitional moment in Mexico between archaic or pre-modern forms of reception and its modern counterparts becomes evident when we note that Couto strategically leaves out from this art historical discussion of painting in Mexico what is probably the most famous and most important sacred image to come out of the colonial period, the Virgen de Guadalupe, which some of my colleagues have talked about. Unlike the other paintings included, which depict images of Christ, Mary, the saints, and biblical narratives, are identified by artists and are examined formally and stylistically, the Guadalupe image is absent. Given the Guadalupe's icon's chiropoietic or spontaneous divine origin, that it miraculously appeared on Juan Diego's mantle in 1535, the reason seems evident. If the holy image's miraculous origin is to be accepted as truth, then it could not be included in a collection of paintings made by national masters or human hands. That would pose an insurmountable contradiction that would question faith and offend Catholic sensibilities. Other religious images considered miraculous were also left out. It's important to remember that although men like Couto were invested in ensuring and contributing to Mexico's progress and status as a modern nation, they were still Catholic and sensitive to the doctrines of their faith and of the political implications of their actions. We must also recall that conservatives believed in the important role of the church in Mexican society and of religion as a foundation for Mexican national identity. Subsequently, religious images, from a conservative perspective, perfectly embodied a national school of art. The mid-19th century stands as a pivotal moment in Mexican history, where we see the introduction of modern ideas and practices, but also a resistance to the same. These broader secularizing developments that started in Northern Europe and have been sort of promoted as shaping the modern world were not monolithic or complete. We see the coexistence of archaic or pre-modern expressions of faith alongside modern sensibilities. Colonial religious images were caught in the middle, forming a kind of dialectic centered on identifying the right path for Mexico, one that acknowledged and respected its past while simultaneously focused on its future. What recognizing Coto's approach in both his gallery and his text reveals is that for Mexico, this shift was not so linear and clean, but rather messy, complicated, and unresolved. Now here I'm reminded of an afternoon I spent at the Museo Nacional de Arte in Mexico City when I was living there as a graduate student. I was studying Coto's original collection of colonial paintings, which had been fortuitously and wisely maintained as a group and on display at the museum. That day, as I approached each painting with the zeal of a doctoral student intent on understanding how such subjects were conceptualized, made, and engaged, I witnessed an elderly Mexican man in the museum gallery standing before a painting of the Virgin Mary, and he silently made the sign of the cross and was praying before the image. Standing in the painting galleries of one of the most highly esteemed museums in the Mexican capital and witnessing this simple and quiet act in this profane environment of the Viceregal Gallery painting was a simultaneously jarring and beautiful sight to behold, one that demonstrated the power of faith and the continuing effective charge both projected onto and derived from these images of sacred subjects. It was then that I understood that the modern museal turn did not completely obliterate the holy significance of these images, that even though new signifying potentials were layered onto it. Its basic reception theory, the object remains the same. It is the context of engagement and the viewer who brings meaning to the work then as now. Can faith and modernity coexist? Well, of course. We see it every day in our corner of the world and in the Catholic parts of the globe. This recognition troubles the modernist notion of linear progress in time. It is precisely in that caesura, that perceived gap between pre-modern and modern, between faith and emotion and intellect and rationality, that the power of such images is to be located. These paintings continue to be significant not only because of the identity of their makers, the dates of their production, or what is written about them, because of the hold they continue to have on us. These paintings speak to everyone, whether they are seen as providing salvation to the soul, as cultural artifacts that stimulate the intellect, or simply for presenting a respite or escape from daily life. Whether you are a person of faith or an agnostic academic, these works continue to add meaning to our lives as testaments to human ingenuity and our common desire for something beyond the mundane. Thank you.
Okay, we will take a couple of questions while we get set up for the rest of the.
Thank you so much, Ray. That was absolutely riveting. I have a question about the afterlives of the spaces from which the paintings were taken from. And I know that, it kind of depends on where you are and at what moment, but I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about, what's happening in those buildings from which the paintings were removed at that time.
Yeah, well, when Coto reached out to the churches and monasteries, he got a wide range of responses. Some churches for whom the cult image that Coto wanted was important, they were like, no, we're not gonna give this painting to you. Other churches or monasteries were like, we'll give you this painting if you have your academy professors or students paint a copy so we can put it back in what would be an opening in the altarpiece to keep the altarpiece sort of its thematic threads together. Other churches and monasteries were like, yeah, we'll give it to you, but promise us funding in the future when we need it. There was a wide variety of responses. I would say that the majority, like 50% of the responses, unequivocally volunteered whatever he wanted. But the other 50%, he had to negotiate. And there were different responses to that. So paintings that were removed were typically replaced, either with new paintings or copies. Okay, and the churches continue to be used. I mean, the country is still Catholic. I mean, there has been growing secularization over time, but the country is still Catholic, and they're still functioning as churches. As was noted earlier, I think Derek mentioned it, the ex convento de Teresa. I mean, it's like a contemporary art space. So a couple of the spaces have been refurbished. They are exhibition spaces. They have been taken over by the government and used for a variety of purposes. And some churches were destroyed in convents, especially in the 19th century to the 20th, when they were like creating new avenues and streets. They tore down and closed churches, and so some churches are gone, some convents are gone, but the ones that are still there tend to still function as churches. You can go to Mexico City and you can walk into any of these churches, and the altarpieces are up, people are still praying, masses are still being held, so they're still mostly intact. Yeah.
Another question.
Thank you so much, Ray. I really appreciated how you talked about Cotto, and I was thinking about not only is he the first art historian of a national, Mexican art, but he's also the first curator in a way. So I was really curious to hear a little bit more about your research, if there was anything in the archives regarding his process of selecting works, of those 91 works. Does he talk about what he rejected? Does he talk about what the process was like to frame these paintings? Because if they're being pulled from the tableaus, they had to, you had to create freestanding frames for these. And then, once he did assemble this corpus, how did he actually go about hanging the works?
Yeah, I mean, there is some information on this in the archives. I spent a lot of time in the Academy archives. There are two separate archives related to this material. They're the 18th century archives that are actually housed in the School of Architecture at the UNAM. The 19th and 20th century archives are actually physically at the Academy. And I did find in the archives letters, I mean, the inventories are there, the invoices, the contracts, between Cotto and the different churches and monasteries. So there is documentation that helps us understand what the process of collecting was and the kinds of responses he got. Now, in terms of his role as a curator, there were museums that opened in the 1820s, but not art museums. There were museums of antiquities. One of the first national museums that opened, I think in 1824, 1826, was a museum of weapons and armor. So there were the museum concept was really entering sort of the Mexican imaginary, but the art museum did not exist and would not exist for a while. So this is what makes Cotto's work so significant, because this was the first time that these kinds of paintings were being displayed in a non-religious institution as works of art. Okay? There was no model for this. I always get the question, why did he write a dialogue? And because there is no art historical tradition, but there is a very ancient dialogic tradition that was familiar these Mexican elites are well educated and they've traveled. Many of them went to Europe. There is this dialogic tradition that goes back to the ancient world where you have sometimes it's a teacher and a student. In this case, there were three individuals who have conversations. Questions are posed and then the teacher or master answers them. And by reading it, you become educated as well. So the dialogic format has a very long distinguished history as an instructional tool. And at this point, there are a lot of gaps of knowledge. They don't know their art history. They don't have a lot. The only names they were able to collect, not all colonial painting was signed, were the names that were present on some of the canvases in the churches. So it's missing a lot of artists. The dating is off. Like the earliest artist, Baltasar de Chave, it doesn't say Orio or Abi, it's just Baltasar de Chave. They were conflating the father and son's work. It was dated to the early 17th century. There were there's a group of indigenous artists who were named, like Marcos Sipac. But the official painters really don't start till the 17th. So there's some errors that really are just reflective of the state of knowledge. But one of the things, I have an article coming out about that very exact question. It's an article that's going to come out in an edited volume being published by CASVA, the National Gallery of Art in DC, in collaboration with the Zentrale Institut für Kunstgeschichte in Munich. And it's on art academies in Europe and the Americas, 1690. And my article talks about this to some extent, is that he was working with Pellegrin Clavé. When they reopened the gallery in 1846, of course, even though it's independent Mexico, they're emulating European art forms and languages, so they go to Europe to interview professors. So all the faculty hired at the academy are European, and Pellegrin Clavé is hired. He's from Spain, Catalan. He, like every artist during the time, had spent time in Rome. He studied at San Luca, where he was exposed to the current debates around neoclassicism, the new kind of encroaching romanticism, aesthetic, Italian purism. The Italian purists felt that contemporary art was superficial and that we should look back at the religious art of the early Renaissance and late medieval. It's kind of a look backwards, to bring back religious subject matter. So he was exposed to that, and there was a group of primarily Austrian artists led by Johann Friedrich Overbeck, the Nazarenes, that he became a part of. So he was exposed to these ideas, and the Mexican art historian Esther Acevedo claims that the reason he wasn't the best painter. There was a French painter and a German and Italian. He wasn't the strongest painter, but he was a fervent Catholic and was pushing these Nazarene purist ideas that appealed to the Mexican conservatives who were really invested in the church and religious culture. So that's why he got the job. So when he gets hired, he moves to Mexico City, and his charge is to train the next generation of Mexican artists and create a modern or new national school. Okay, but because he worked in Italy, he was familiar with, one of his teachers was Francesco Guattani, and Guattani published what's considered to be, this is what I note in the article, no one else has made this observation, but I was reading his publication that was published around 1804 called La Pittura Comparata. And it's all about defining an Italian tradition. There are these nationalist kinds of interests, and he focuses on history painting. There's no portraiture, still life. No, it's all painting, and he provides biographical information and analyzes the paintings, and he surely was familiar with that. Juana Gutierrez Aces, the late Juana Gutierrez, who's one of my mentors, she noted that Goto in his library probably had all the German publications like Winkelmann, Mengs, etc. And I'm working with Clavé, I'm pretty sure he was familiar with the Italian academic publications, and I think those were the models that he was looking at because there was nothing local. So of course he's looking to, especially Italy, and through Clavé, he became familiar with those models.